Somewhere off the southern coast of Japan, on a morning that looked like every other morning, a fisherman pulled in his net. It was sometime in the mid-1990s. The water was cold. The catch was ordinary. And then the net came up wrong. Too heavy, dragging differently, catching on something that had no business being on the ocean floor in a fishing zone. When the net broke the surface, it carried metal. Not modern metal, not a lost anchor, not industrial debris. Old metal, corroded, sea-eaten, shaped in a way that didn't belong to any ship or buoy or piece of civilian equipment the fisherman had ever seen. An engine block, a propeller, a section of wing. He didn't know what he was looking at. He brought it to shore anyway. For 50 years, those pieces sat in Japan. They passed through hands. They were examined. They were partially identified. And they were eventually turned over to Japanese officials who understood what they might be. In 2016, 71 years after the war ended, Japanese authorities formally returned the fragments to the United States Navy. And in 2023, those fragments came home to the ship they had left from. The USS Intrepid, the aircraft carrier that had launched them on March 18, 1945, on a strike mission against the Japanese naval airbase at Saiki on the northern coast of Kyushu. The fragments belonged to an F4U-1D Corsair fighter bomber. And the Corsair belonged, at least for the last moments of his life, to a 21-year-old farm boy from Missouri who had been married for exactly 5 weeks when he climbed into the cockpit for the first and last time in combat. His name was Loren Isley. This is the story of his plane, his ship, his war, and the fisherman who, without knowing it, closed an 80-year-old case. To understand what happened on March 18th, 1945, you need to understand what USS Intrepid was and what it had already survived by the time Loren Isley came aboard. The Intrepid was an Essex-class aircraft carrier, the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. She was commissioned on August 16, 1943, at Newport News, Virginia, and by January 1944, she was at Pearl Harbor, preparing for the assault on the Marshall Islands. Essex-class carriers were the workhorses of the Pacific War. At 872 feet long, with a displacement of 27,100 tons, they carried over 80 aircraft and a crew of more than 3,000 men. They were fast, capable of 33 knots, and they were designed to project American air power across an ocean that Japan had controlled just 2 years earlier. Intrepid arrived in the Pacific at the beginning of 1944, and from her first day in the combat zone, she proved both lethal and unlucky, or perhaps more accurately, a ship that survived things that should have killed her. In February 1944, Intrepid's aircraft participated in the first-ever carrier raid on Truk Lagoon, the fortified Japanese anchorage in the Caroline Islands that the U.S. Navy considered the most heavily defended position in the Pacific. The raid destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft and more than 50 ships. Intrepid's air groups flew through some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire in the Pacific War and returned. She was then hit by a Japanese torpedo during a night attack. The damage was severe enough to require repairs in San Francisco. She returned to the Pacific in August 1944, re-entering the war during the Philippines campaign. On October 30th, a kamikaze crashed into her flight deck. 10 men killed. She stayed at her station and kept flying aircraft. On November 25th, 1944, shortly after noon, a heavy wave of Japanese aircraft struck the carrier task force. Within 5 minutes, 2 kamikazes crashed into Intrepid in rapid succession. The first hit caused an explosion and fire near the island. The second crashed seconds later, adding to the devastation. When the damage reports were finally totaled, 60 men were dead, 15 missing, and over 100 wounded. The Intrepid never lost propulsion. She never left her station in the task group. In less than 2 hours, her crew had extinguished the last fire. The crew gave her a nickname. They called her the Evil Eye, not as an insult, as recognition. A ship this damaged, surviving this many times, had to have something in it that ordinary ships didn't. The Evil Eye went back to San Francisco for repairs. Again, she returned to the Pacific in February 1945. The war was entering its final, most brutal phase. The Allied advance had reached the Japanese home islands. The battle for Okinawa, the last major island battle before an invasion of Japan itself, was weeks away, and the strikes on Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, were intensifying. It was into this final act of the Pacific War that Loren Isley arrived aboard USS Intrepid. Loren Isley was born in Missouri. The details of his childhood are sparse. He was, by all accounts, a farm boy, one of millions of young American men whose lives were interrupted and ultimately ended by a war that began with an attack on a naval base he had probably never heard of. He was 21 years old. In February 1945, 5 weeks before his final mission, he married his high school sweetheart. The records don't tell us much more than that. His nephew Dale, who was born 5 years after Loren's death and never met him, describes what the family knew. A young man who loved flying, who had trained hard, who shipped out to the Pacific as one of thousands of naval aviators being fed into the final campaign against Japan. He arrived aboard Intrepid as part of the air group assigned to strike missions against Kyushu in the weeks before Okinawa. The Corsair pilots of that air group had a specific mission: attack Japanese naval air bases to destroy the aircraft that would otherwise be used in kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. The logic was brutal and simple. If you didn't destroy those planes on the ground, they would be flown into your ships by pilots who had trained specifically to die in the attempt. The strikes on Kyushu were, in effect, preventive killing, an effort to reduce the number of suicide attacks before Okinawa began. The F4U-1D Corsair that Loren Isley flew was one of the most capable aircraft in the Pacific War. The Corsair had earned a combat record that few aircraft in any war have matched, an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters across the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese called it Whistling Death, a name earned from the sound of air passing through the wing root intakes during a dive. Marine and Navy pilots flew it from Guadalcanal to Okinawa in every major campaign. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 rockets. It was fast, it was tough, and it was exactly the aircraft you wanted for a strike mission against a defended target. On the morning of March 18, 1945, 19 F4U Corsair fighter bombers launched from USS Intrepid with orders to strike the naval air base at Saiki, a major Japanese naval aviation facility on the northern coast of Kyushu. It was Loren Isley's first combat mission. The formation flew north. The target was approximately 400 miles from the carrier, a long mission, deep into enemy airspace, over a defended coast. The strike was part of a coordinated campaign against Kyushu air bases, with multiple carrier groups launching simultaneously to overwhelm Japanese defenses. 17 of the 19 aircraft returned to Intrepid. Loren Isley was not among them. The official record contains 3 words that appear in thousands of American casualty reports from the Pacific: missing in action. No further details, no coordinates, no witness account specific enough to determine where the aircraft went down, or in what condition, or whether the pilot had any chance of survival. For the Isley family in Missouri, the notification came, and then nothing. A telegram followed by silence. The war ended in August. The other boys came home. Loren did not. His body was never recovered. For 78 years, the family carried that silence. The F4U Corsair was not supposed to be a carrier aircraft. That is one of the stranger facts about one of the most successful naval fighters ever built. The Corsair was designed in 1938 as a pure naval fighter, built around the most powerful aircraft engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced over 2,000 horsepower. To absorb that power without the propeller striking the deck, Vought's designers gave it the longest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft up to that point. 13 feet, 4 inches. That propeller required a landing gear tall enough to clear the ground, which in turn pushed the cockpit back along the fuselage, which in turn created a visibility problem on approach. The Corsair's nose blocked the pilot's view of the carrier deck during the final stages of a carrier landing. The Navy tested it, declared it unsuitable for carrier operations, and turned it over to the Marine Corps for land-based operations in the Solomons. The Marines flew it against the Japanese in February 1943, and within weeks were reporting kill ratios that the Navy had never seen from any of their own aircraft. The Corsair was not just effective, it was dominant. The Japanese fighters of 1943 could not match it above 14,000 feet, and at lower altitudes its speed and firepower made it nearly impossible to defeat in a straight engagement. The Navy eventually solved the carrier landing problem, partially by having pilots approach at a higher speed and partially through British modifications that had already proven the Corsair could operate from fleet carriers. By 1944, Corsairs were flying from American carriers alongside Hellcats. By 1945, Navy Corsair squadrons were conducting some of the most demanding strike operations of the Pacific War. The F4U-1D variant that Loren Isley flew was the fighter-bomber evolution of the design. A water-injected engine for emergency power boost, hardpoints for a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing, and the full armament of 6 heavy machine guns. It was an aircraft that could fight its way through Japanese interceptors and then deliver its bombs onto the target. What it was not, in 1945, was indestructible. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses over Kyushu in early 1945 were among the most concentrated in the Pacific theater. The Japanese military command understood that Kyushu was the staging ground for the anticipated American invasion of the home islands, and they had positioned the most modern and capable anti-aircraft systems available to defend it. Radar-directed 75mm guns, heavy 120mm naval AA batteries, and dense networks of lighter automatic weapons covered the approaches to every airfield and naval facility on the island. A Corsair, coming in at low altitude on a strike run against Saiki Naval Air Base in March 1945, was flying through one of the most lethal anti-aircraft environments in the world. We don't know exactly what happened to Loren Isley's aircraft. No one who survived the mission that day left a detailed account of where and how his Corsair was lost. The plane went down. It went into the water somewhere off the coast of Kyushu, and that was the last anyone knew. Until the net came up. The exact identity of the Japanese fisherman who pulled the Corsair fragments from the sea has not been publicly documented. The circumstances suggest it happened sometime in the 1990s, decades after the war, in water that was Japanese fishing territory, far enough offshore that the wreckage had been preserved rather than disturbed. What happened to the fragments in the years between the discovery and 2016 is only partially documented. They were examined. The engine block and propeller were identified as American military aviation components. Efforts were made to trace their origin. The process was slow. It required matching the specific production details of the recovered components against U.S. Navy records of aircraft lost in the region. Aircraft identification from recovered components is meticulous work. A Corsair engine block carries a manufacturer's serial number, if it survives, that can be traced through Pratt & Whitney production records and then cross-referenced against Navy assignment records linking specific engines to specific airframes and specific aircraft. The process requires records from multiple archives, access to Navy loss reports, and in many cases, the assistance of specialists in Pacific War aviation history who have spent decades building databases of aircraft losses. In 2016, Japanese officials formally returned the fragments to the United States Navy. The handover was part of a broader pattern of U.S.-Japan cooperation on recovering the remains of war dead and the artifacts associated with them. A process that had been ongoing since the 1970s and that both governments had formalized through a series of bilateral agreements. The fragments, the engine, the propeller, and the section of wing were transferred to U.S. custody and eventually made their way to the Intrepid Museum in New York City, the aircraft carrier that Loren Isley had launched from on the morning of March 18, 1945. The museum's curatorial team, led by aviation curator Eric Bohm, began the process of verification and documentation that would connect these fragments to a specific pilot. The research led through Navy loss records, Pacific War archives, and eventually, through Ancestry.com, to Dale Isley in Missouri. Loren's nephew, a man who had been born 5 years after his uncle's death, who had grown up knowing Loren only as a name and a photograph and a story his family told with a particular restraint of people who have learned to carry grief quietly. Dale Isley had not expected this call. For 78 years, his entire life, the family had understood that Loren's plane was on the bottom of the Pacific and would stay there. The category of loss they lived with was the complete kind. No grave, no marker, no confirmation, no object to hold. Just a name on a list and a telegram from the Navy, and the knowledge that he'd gone out and not come back. When Eric Bohm called and explained what the museum had found, Dale Isley said something that no aviation curator in the world would ever forget. He said, "This was the plane that he flew. This is the plane that he died in." It's hard to explain how an inanimate object like that can really be a powerful connection to someone you never even met. The exhibition that opened at the Intrepid Museum in September 2023, titled Final Flight, The Story of a World War II Corsair, is built around those three fragments and the story they make possible. The engine, the propeller, the section of wing. They are not beautiful objects. 78 years in salt water had done what salt water does: corroded the aluminum, thickened the surfaces with encrustation, blurred the details that would have been sharp and precise when the aircraft rolled off the production line at Vaught's plant in Stratford, Connecticut in 1944. They are broken pieces of a broken aircraft. They are evidence, not trophies. Alongside them in the exhibition are the personal artifacts that Dale Isley and the family donated: Loren's medals, including his Purple Heart, his naval airpin, a personalized lighter, photographs, the kind of objects that a 21-year-old man carries when he ships out for war. The things that fit in a pocket, the things that come home when the man doesn't. The exhibition is not a celebration. It is a reckoning. The curator Eric Boehm put it precisely when he described what the aircraft meant in the context of its return. That airplane left the deck of the Intrepid in 1945. It returned in 2023 without its pilot. That phrase contains the entire weight of what aviation archaeology is when it is done right. Not the restoration of a machine to flying condition, not the theatrical triumph of a crane pulling something famous from the water. The quiet, methodical work of connecting a broken object to the person who last touched it, and returning both, the object and the connection, to the family that has been waiting, without quite believing the wait would ever end. Loren Isley's body has never been found. The ocean around Saiki, Japan, holds what remains of him. That part of the story has no closure. But the plane came back, and with it, a fact that the family had been denied for 78 years. Confirmation. Not missing, not lost, without trace. Shot down on his first mission on March 18, 1945, over the coast of Kyushu, in an F4U-1D Corsair that a Japanese fisherman would pull from the sea half a century later. That is not nothing. There is a question buried in this story that deserves to be asked directly. Why does it matter? The war has been over for 80 years. The people who fought it are almost all gone. Loren Isley would be over 100 years old if he had survived. The last veterans of the Pacific campaign are in their late 90s. The Intrepid herself, the Evil Eye, the ship that survived kamikaze attacks and torpedoes and decades of service, is a museum on the Hudson River, where children on school trips run across her flight deck without knowing that 60 men died on it in a single afternoon in November 1944. Why does it matter that a fisherman found an engine block? Why does it matter that curators traced a serial number through 50-year-old records? Why does it matter that a man in Missouri got a phone call about an uncle he never met? The answer the aviation archaeology community gives is a practical one. Families deserve closure. Nations have obligations to account for their war dead. The technology to identify aircraft wrecks and human remains has advanced to the point where recoveries that were impossible in 1950 are routine in 2023. These answers are correct. They are also insufficient. The deeper answer is about what we lose when we lose the objects. Loren Isley was 21 years old. He was a farm boy from Missouri. He married his high school sweetheart in February 1945, and shipped out to the Pacific and flew one mission and died in it. He is one of hundreds of thousands of young men who did exactly that across 6 years of World War. Men who existed, who were loved, who had plans and habits, and favorite foods and specific ways of laughing, and who became, in the official records, a category, a statistic, missing in action. The fragments of his Corsair do not restore his life. They do not replace what was lost. They cannot give Dale Isley an uncle, or give Loren's wife the husband she had for 5 weeks, or give the family in Missouri the decades of ordinary life that the war took. But they do something that no document, no memorial, no official recognition can do. They prove he was real, not a name on a list. A man who climbed into a specific aircraft with a specific engine that bore a specific serial number on a specific morning and flew north toward a defended coast because his country asked him to. The plane is evidence, and after 80 years at the bottom of the Pacific, it came home. The fisherman who pulled it from the water didn't know any of this. He was just a man with a net that came up heavy on an ordinary morning off the coast of Japan. But what he found in that net was not junk. It was proof.